All right, looks like we're ready to get started. Thanks everybody for attending today. Today's webinar is entitled 3 Steps to Secure Single Sign-On and Access Control, brought to you by Forum Systems and myself, Jason Macy, the Chief Technical Officer. In today's session, we're going to look at the various aspects of what goes into access control and single sign-on and how to simplify the actual ability to secure and deploy solutions that can actually accomplish this in a much more simplified manner than what is often a very complex landscape and process to try to understand. And so in today's session, we're really going to look at and focus on what it is, what it means to have access control and SSO, the key aspects of that, and how we can frame that and simplify that to have secure ability to do that in a unified way. So when we look at the key aspects of this, there's really 3 components of access control and SSO. If you break it right down, it's you want to authenticate the user, you want to authorize the user. Now when we talk about authorization of the user, we're talking about really the combination of role-based access control, what the user can do and who the user is, and what the user is allowed to sort of access, but also the content-based access control component of that, what information is being retrieved or sent in and out of the environment. And then finally, federation of the user is the intent by which to use a credential, some information about a user such that it can be used for single sign-on across different systems and across different services. And so those key aspects are what we're going to focus on first, to break them down into what it means to then support that from an access control and SSO perspective. So let's start with the authenticate. The landscape of modern infrastructure and internet is quite complex in nature. There's tons and tons of different client variants and tons of servers and services and APIs. And what that unfortunately gives is a complex means to try to frame the identity component of authentication. And unfortunately, it's primarily due to the fact that most authentication is done at what we call end mile, whereas the identification and authentication is actually done at the service itself, at the endpoint of where the service actually resides. And so if you think about that complexity and you look at how many of those there are, it starts to get quite complex indeed. Let's look at it and isolate a case where we're focused on one of these scenarios, one of these services in this complex landscape, and see how that identity authentication is truly one of the sort of bottlenecks, if you will, in terms of being able to be more efficient about doing access control and SSO. This endpoint service, this end-mile service, resides in a virtual environment, a cloud environment, or maybe an on-premise service that accomplishes some data transfer, some information flow. And within that infrastructure or environment, there's some kind of identity policy server that's there that provides user credentials information and policy information and sort of provides the means to centralize that, all very important pieces. But the issue is that you've got to embed identity agents on those end-mile services in order to allow those systems to understand whether or not users are allowed to access the information in question. The access control and authentication is actually accomplished through those identity agents that have to be embedded that call back and forth to an identity policy server. Well, in the simple case, that's fine. But as you note, in terms of this, the complexity and scale as new services are built, infrastructures are more complex, that gets far, far more difficult to sustain when you have multiple endpoints and multiple kinds of policy decisions and multiple calls back and forth to a policy server infrastructure. This form of authentication is a primary aspect of most environment deployments out there. It's mostly rooted in legacy agent-based architecture, but it is one of the most difficult aspects of trying to scale and simplify the SSO and access control scenario because of the the hurdles and issues with end-mile authentication, scalability issues, management issues. Think about all the different patch revisions and operating systems and developers that have come and gone, and trying to maintain that all at end-mile services is simply cost prohibitive, and it's always going to be a glass ceiling on scalability and the ability by which to really achieve the goals of centralization. And so what we're going to do is take that and look at this in a different way. The complex end-mile identity authentication really is comprised of, if we take out the endpoint aspect, what we're really focused on is the identity information itself that's being sent in, from the client side in. And if we take that and we really sort of then encapsulate that in truly what that is, and we look at that then in terms of the various different formats, and with technology that's purpose-built that can actually handle and understand all of those formats in one central location, we can simply take all of those formats and call that an agentless authentication, where we can accomplish the authentication without the need of end-mile agents. And that will enable a simple process of that primary component, that first component of our access control and SSO, which is the authentication component. So that's one starting point to build from, is to unify and simplify that. Now, let's go on to authorization. Fine, so now that we've got a way to simplify authenticating users, how then can we simplify the authorization process? And that authorization process, as noted, is really in two parts. You're not just, in the modern era of services and APIs, it's not just go, no go. It's based on content. It's based on the information that's within requests and responses that are coming in and going out of the environment and infrastructure. And there's a lot of different variants of client technologies and consumers that we have to consider in terms of authorizing what information is allowed and what isn't. The diversity of information formats is really where we need to focus on how do we authorize based on content. Content can be RESTful services, XML, JSON, HTML, all kinds of different variants, but framed in a at least a confined set of what we call sort of modern day message formats, structured message formats. But the diverse formats require us to be able to understand what's allowed, what's not from a content perspective. So again, let's unravel that down to what it really is, which is the actual data itself, the message payloads themselves that are traversing the internet, traversing the networks, coming in and out of the information boundaries. And let's take all that and focus on simply applying content-based access control in a simplified way across all those contents. What kind of information is allowed by the user based on content? What are they allowed to see and get from an access control perspective based upon that, simplified down to the universal ability to consume and analyze those different message formats to make those decisions. So that's one part of the authorization equation. The other part is the role-based access control. This is one most are familiar with, what a user is allowed to do. And that could be based on two different things. You've got different, for example, just one example of mobility, mobile apps. Well, you may have a particular user that has several apps or several services that it needs to invoke. Based on the roles of that user, it may have different roles through one app access point than it does through another, depending on what it's getting, what it's accessing, and where it's going. And the other consideration is it may be the same app, the same or the same service that's being consumed, where you've got different users. You've got Mr. I Get Everything that basically can get all kinds of information it wants through that central application, and then you've got user I Get Some stuff, which is maybe not as much stuff, but some. And then you've got another user that gets completely different information, but all through the same exact service. So how do we then frame that from an authorization perspective, say who gets to come in, what do they get to see based on the different roles? Well, the one point in which to do that is to abstract that out in a way by which we can look at and inspect some of that information about the authentication that comes in, and then couple that with the notion of roles, and thus centralize then the ability to look at identity management and identity of the user in order to determine the roles and determine then the data that's enabled and allowed to go back to those users. Role-based access control isn't just go, no go. It's what they can go, where they can go, and what they can see in terms of the user rights and roles and responsibilities. And again, what we want to do is frame this in a simple role-based access control context where we can unify that decision point and simply call it role-based access control. So now we've got our authentication simplicity that we're trying to simplify, our authorization for what we call CBAC, content-based access control, and RBAC, role-based access control. And finally, the federate component of this. How do we basically provide then the SSO capabilities to federate tokens? Similarly, in terms of SSO, single sign-on, the concept there is that as clients come in and perform that initial authentication handshake, and again, going back to the authentication, that could be in many different formats, many different client variants. You know, this example isn't limited in any way to mobile. It's just what that authentication sequence is across those various formats we saw a few slides earlier in order to establish who the user is. So once that authentication sequence, whatever it may be, you know, single factor, dual factor, is accomplished, then now we know with some validity who the user is through that authentication. And from that, passing that through some tiered system, we can take that information and map some interesting properties of that client from that authentication so that back-end systems and services know who and what was authenticated upstream. Again, we're far removed now from end-mile authentication. We're centralizing authentication, agentless authentication, and passing forward the same information to endpoint services that otherwise an agent would have to go out and retrieve. It automatically arrives and appears as expected. When the response comes back through, then we build an SSO token so that effectively we have then a means to track subsequent requests that a user is attempting to make without having to go back and re-authenticate with that SSO session. And then you now have the ability to access your different services with the same credential set. And these services could be within the same environment, within different environments. Often they're out in the cloud, virtual environments, and that SSO mechanism from a federation perspective is meant to provide the same means of access from an initial credential authentication that can then go and access different services with that same SSO credential. So the user experience is unified. That single point of authentication gains access to multiple points. That is the hallmark of single sign-on SSO. And it is comprised of the necessity to have a centralized place to manage the SSO sessions itself. And so as we look at this in terms of what we're really focused on is the session management, the ability to validate and control the life cycle of single sign-on tokens so that we can enable them for access to other systems to basically delegate the authority of those credentials to access other systems. So we got our authentication that we've broken down to effectively try to make it simpler and easier in terms of the fact that we know there's a complex spectrum, but we want to focus on simply the ability to authenticate across all those formats. Role-based access control, the ability to define the user's ability to access environments and information, based on their roles and what they're allowed to see. Content-based access control. What is the data? What is inside the payload? The information that the user is trying to retrieve or the system is trying to retrieve or send in is an important part of access control because it is in conjunction with the role often defined as to what can be retrieved or consumed. And then finally, session management, as we've seen, the ability then to take all those credentials and decisions of access control and content access control and roll it into a single sign-on mechanism that can then enable that single sign-on token variant to be used to access other systems and other information, but still enable those same decision points of authorization based upon the SSO information. Well, obviously, all of this leads us up to the point of focused on then the technology that can accomplish all of this, which is the reason we're here today, which is the forum-centric gateway that provides a unified set of technology within a product architecture that accomplishes those very things by intent. Purpose-built technology that centralizes identity enforcement, access control, and SSO, that brings together all of these different technology variants and the ability to consume all these different token formats and message formats, and thus unify through simple policy design how to accomplish authentication, role-based access control, the content-based access control, and the SSO session management. And it's done so at what we call Tier 0, or at the information border, abstracted out from the endpoints by intent so that it's agentless, that it accomplishes these things without actually having to touch the endpoint services, without having to embed information and agents inside the system services themselves. And through that abstraction, we can then unify and provide a much more simplified path to achieving the identity enforcement, access control, and SSO across the landscape of different kinds of services and different kinds of clients and consumers accessing them. This is the fundamental aspect of simplification of the identity access control and SSO. This gets us out of the legacy realm of the agent-based architecture approach to the new realm of centralized gateway identity approach. And that's the focus of what we are looking to showcase today. Now, just a quick background in terms of forum systems, because obviously coming on to this and talking about simplicity, it's important to know how the gateway could possibly do this. Is it really that easy? Is it really, can centralize all this? And the reason I've led up to this point showcasing the technology complexities under the hood is because the API gateway technology is purpose-built to facilitate those types of message exchanges. It is a data intermediary with the purpose intent of providing agile security for the unified identity access control and SSO. And it's different from any other type of technology component because it's vendor agnostic. In other words, it's not specifically tied to a particular type of identity or a particular type of message pattern. It's by intent meant to handle all of those different variants of identity and all of those different noted variants of message patterns. And that allows you to greatly simplify and build efficiencies into the architecture by having a unified layer that accomplishes your SSO and access control. So those are the important aspects. Another important aspect is when you centralize those decision points, it's important that from an product architecture perspective, that it's a secure platform, it's a secure architecture, because that becomes then an intermediary where you can trust that the decisions and the policies are secure themselves, so that while unifying and recognizing business efficiencies, the platform itself is certified secure. And we've taken great strides within the last 12 years in the industry to achieve the highest pedigree of certifications to ensure that our product technology can not only provide these capabilities, but provide these capabilities in a product technology that's certified secure. Obviously, in the modern day of breaches and vulnerabilities at each and every day, it's readily apparent that sort of traditional approaches to open source technologies and open SSL libraries are all very good in the integration phase, but they certainly suffer once deployed and discovered vulnerable. And so that's really one of the key aspects also from the secure SSO, the secure access control capabilities, is having those aspects. So let's look at how the gateway can do this. What is it that the gateway does that can in fact provide all of these? Well, it is fundamentally and foundationally, again, it's about a 13 years evolved industry product where in the critical path of being able to provide the threat mitigation, the data privacy, the identity enforcement, access control, and SSO. And all of that has evolved to be able to handle and understand all these different message protocol variants, all these different identity tokens through simple policy design. It's purpose-built from a rules perspective to be just an engine by which you can enable, through simple policy design, to modernize your architecture, simplify your architecture, and externalize your information, your services, into APIs, where those then get protected and enforced through a very straightforward policy-based access control and SSO set of rules applicable. And so that is where the gateway provides what we call white space. In terms of the landscape of existing technologies, this component provides now the unification of the RBAC, the CBAC, the role-based, the content-based, the single sign-on and session management at that same architecture tier that you traditionally see your security architecture, like your firewalls and your application firewalls and your IDS systems, where this component effectively allows you to centralize the identity component of that decision there at that same layer, and that abstraction gains tremendous efficiencies in unifying that then across the different variant spectrum of APIs that sit behind it. The virtual infrastructures, private clouds, ESBs, SOA infrastructures, portals, all are eligible transaction data flows that can be centralized through the API gateway to give you that secure access control and SSO with simple policy artifacts. And so how does that really work? Let's take a look. A gateway deployed basically is an interception point, a seamless interception point that presents the API of an infrastructure as an endpoint, a secure protocol break. This is much different than many other technology components that are sort of flow-throughs or pass-throughs or streaming analytic type engines. This is a full protocol break API that does then an analysis on that message pattern from that client. How does it do the analysis? Well, again, going back to the key aspects of authentication, authorization, and SSO. So first, the inspection team takes a look and cracks open that message payload and understands all the different variants of formats. So is it SOAP? Is it XML? Is it REST? Is it JSON? Is it HTML? Are there URL query string parameters? What are the different information flows? And then what are the policies that are expected to enable that client to communicate to the infrastructure service or API, and inspecting that and doing the content-based access control through all the underlying engines that understand all those data formats. Subsequently, looking at then things like the HTTP headers or information inside of the actual message body to analyze and validate that expected information is present and can be used in conjunction with the role-based access control to be deterministic as to whether to allow that transaction to proceed, and then to obviously enrich that message in terms of user properties or information that you can pass forward. Centralizing it here again gives you that entire spectrum of authentication and role-based access control authorization regardless of the kind of credential. So by this very abstraction of an API gateway, you now no longer have to require your clients to adhere to a specific paradigm. You can handle all kinds of different token variants and message authentication variants, and really unify then the ability to expose those services and information and control them without having to put burdens on the clients and the consumers in order to come in to achieve that. Once those basic premise rules are established and validated, we get to the point of passing then that what was previously not secured or validated to then something that's well vetted and assured can continue into the infrastructure to actually invoke that service. Subsequently, as the response comes back, that response is analyzed. The response information is data flowing out of the information boundary, and it's important to inspect that as well, because content-based access control isn't just looking at request information. It's also looking at response information. Deep content inspection and analytics of what data is leaving the actual information boundary, going back out to that calling client or consumer. And that decision point is also part of the transaction path on the response, as is the authorization. Correlation of that inbound identity with response information to allow, maybe filter information, restrict certain data, obfuscate certain data, or reject it entirely, disallow that response based on the fact that that particular client wasn't authorized to that particular response, even though it may have seemed so to on the way in. The response check is also an important part of that whole scenario of authorization. And then finally, when that does go back to the client, it's inclusive of the ability to inject session tracking SSO token information such that that client can then utilize that subsequently to come in and effectively use those that token to achieve single sign-on capabilities. So now we come back to where we began as the 3 steps to secure single sign-on and access control. We arrive at this from having seen all of the various components that really go into what it means to have access control and achieve access control and subsequently achieve single sign-on. So our 3 steps are really quite simple. Our 3 steps start with the deployment of a gateway so that we can abstract our decision point of an enforcement of access control without doing end-mile agent identities, which can never scale, can never be achieved in any unified way because it's disparate, it's legacy. We saw all the issues with the end mile. So the first point is to basically focus on getting a policy engine in place which can provide all of the capabilities of the technology processing, and that is accomplished through the deployment of the gateway. Now, the deployment of the gateway can be in virtual form, hardware form, software form. Get the gateway deployed, and that's the starting point. Now, I put a little bullet point here in terms of deployment time. Really, when I say this is simple, in most of our deployments, this is in fact measured in days. It's not weeks or months, as most projects would be in this spectrum, because of the fact that it's just policy-based, no code. And the deployment schemes are quite easy. It's all encapsulated, purpose-built technology. So the deployment scheme itself, very straightforward, flexible across pretty much any variant of technology out there, virtual technology, hardened, FIPS certified, NDPP certified hardware, and software variants for auto-provisioned and scriptable type deployments. And then secondly, we build the policies. Rather than building agents and integrating agents into infrastructure and trying to code security and identity into end-mount, we just build policies. What is the authentication policy? What are the message formats? What are our authorization criteria? What kinds of SSO do we want to build? We can use SAML, we can use OAuth, we can use cookies. What kind of authentication do we want to have? Well, single factor, dual factor? It's point and click. It's all out of the box capable. This is what the purpose-built technology does, is it gives you all that capability with simple point and click policy creation through various different types of administrative APIs. Per each policy flow, legitimately, couple days. We've done so many complex use cases out there in SSO realm, and I'm going to share a couple of them with you in a few minutes. Most of these technology deployments, when it comes down to what it takes to actually build and create the policy flows, it's quite nominal because it's all encapsulated. You don't have to worry about all the nuances and complexity of the technology. You just have to build the rules and let the product take care of the rest. And then finally, the standard information flow then just simply needs to be redirected to enable that information flow to then flow through Sentry. So those rules can be enforced and applied. Now this is often quite seamless in terms of anything that a client or a service infrastructure, often not a single line of code has to change in either place to basically be a seamless intermediary, and that's usually through a virtual IP VIP update on the load balancer or DNS change to redirect it. And then Sentry becomes the endpoint that clients are communicating with and brokering on behalf, but accomplishing all of those abstracted SSO access control capabilities through those rules and policies that were enabled. And really, that is, basically that straightforward. Now, just to give some sort of credibility to all this, beyond obviously listening to me talk about it, let me just talk about a couple of things that you'd be probably pretty familiar with out there, how we do this today. For example, one of our deployments has been out there since 2006 for the largest software project ever in the U.S., which is every tax return in the United States. Both business and personal is processed via Forum Sentry. Process meaning on the edge of the information boundary, accomplishing these very things we discussed today. SAML SSO in this case with two-factor authentication and authorization, content-based authorization. That is basically how every person in the United States and every business in the United States electronically files with the U.S. government through Forum Sentry technology that accomplishes all these things in an abstracted layer at the border, at the edge of the network. And it goes back to all the things we've simply discussed today. Leveraging the technology to do the authentication, that initial authentication, which is in this case a two-way SSL mutual authentication with a layered user identity on top, which then gets you sort of the authentication of the user. Authorization is then based on the content of the message, along with obviously the roles and rights of the user from a role perspective from the policy server's response. And then subsequently, as that information comes in and goes back, the SAML assertion is generated in this case to accomplish the single sign-on ability to have SAML-based authentication subsequently for some period of time. All of that is simple point-and-click rules established on Sentry. Now, a single line of code was written to achieve all of that. So the adoption of this particular use case is, one of the most computationally intensive and from a flow perspective, quite big, especially on the April 15th and September 15th days. But ultimately, the key is centralizing, using purpose-built technology to accomplish it, and having the pedigree to be in that critical path. All the revenue of the U.S. government is pretty important. And that's one of the key aspects of Sentry, and why certifications matter and why security matters. It's not just always accomplishing the business goal, but accomplishing in the way that you can be sure is secure is the hallmark of really how we approach this solution space and provide that ability to do the access control and single sign-on in a secure manner. Let me give you just one other example. A company you may have heard of, General Electric. Similar concepts in terms of wanting to centralize. General Electric is a very big company, Fortune 8 company. They've got tons and tons of business units, and they've got tons and tons of services, thousands of APIs, SOA infrastructures, web portals. And what General Electric has done in combination with Forum Systems is look at and unify the way in which communication and information comes in and out of the General Electric corporate boundary in a manner that's secure through our FIPS certification. But where it's the same concepts we've already discussed that Sentry provides for, that abstraction, that agentless ability to do identity and authorization and single sign-on in what is called basically an API.ge.com, a unified central point of all, in this case, apps for mobile apps, where the apps reside in the cloud and they actually call into API endpoint services within the architecture of GE, all facilitated through authorization, single sign-on checks that Sentry accomplishes. Again, not a single line of code was written to do this. This is simple point-and-click rule creation on what kinds of access control, what kinds of message formats are allowable, what kinds of single sign-on. In this case, we utilize our OAuth capabilities to do OAuth-based tokens, SSO. But all of that really is meant to just provide some baseline of industry adoption. There's hundreds more that we've done and accomplished. This is proven time and again. And really what our purpose today is to showcase that it's really quite simple in nature to do this when you use the technology that's been designed to accomplish it. By abstracting into agentless technology and utilizing this layer to do access control through content, through role, through SSO, you simplify and build efficiencies that you could only have, could have never achieved through the traditional end file mechanism. And that's fundamentally where we continue to want to showcase those capabilities and how really through simple three-step process we can get to that point of simplification by which we're able to achieve that secure SSO and access control. So thank you very much, everybody. I am going to stay on the line for the next 10 minutes or so.